Virtual? No, vertical. It's Vertical Force on Virtual Boy Works episode 10. Hudson produced a second release for Virtual Boy that came out directly on the heels of Panic Bomber in the US. And unlike the previous game, Vertical Force wasn't simply a conversion of an existing multi-platform title. It does, however, hew close to Hudson's core competency, just as much as Bomberman. Vertical Force is the most traditional console-style shoot-'em-up on Virtual Boy. Not that there was much competition, with Red Alarm going for immersive 3D and Waterworld being, well, whatever the heck it was that Waterworld was supposed to be. On the other hand, Vertical Force could just as easily have been called Star Soldier 3D. It's built in the style and format of Hudson's successful PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16 shooters, using many similar mechanics. Players control a starfighter scrolling upward and gunning down endless waves of enemy craft, facing off against huge bosses and gathering power-up icons along the way to boost the fighter's capabilities. You get a single life per game, though your craft doesn't explode upon contact. It can soak up about half a dozen hits. And it's okay. Vertical Force is visually pretty impressive. It's possibly the most graphically detailed game on Virtual Boy, with multiple layers of complex-looking space fortress structures to fly through. But overall, it feels a bit on the sloppy side, which may come as a bit of a surprise given Hudson's track record with shooters in the 90s. Shooters were kind of Hudson's thing. Company spokesperson Toshiyuki Takahashi made his name for his remarkable skill at the original Star Soldier and its predecessor Star Force. And Hudson hosted shooter-focused caravan events every year for nearly a decade in the 80s and 90s. A closer look at Vertical Force's credits, however, reveals a disappointing truth. None of the game's creative leads had any previous experience with any of those famous shooters. Folks like producer Kazunori Yasui and director Hitoshi Okuno primarily had experience with adventure games, Bomberman titles, the Newtopia action RPG series, and various and sundry Game Boy titles. This is the equivalent of Disney promoting a movie as being from the studio that brought you The Avengers, despite having no involvement by anyone who actually worked on The Avengers. Hudson collectively knew shooters, but they weren't really the Vertical Force team's forte. Which isn't to say Vertical Force is bad. It's certainly ambitious, and it brings the Star Soldier concept into Virtual Boy's 3D in a smart way. One of the defining features of Star Soldier, especially in its early entries, was its use of layering, as players could fly beneath structures within the environment. Vertical Force takes that idea and makes it into a central mechanic, creating multi-level stages that require players to move into and out of the background in order to slip around these structures. If this sounds oddly familiar, that's because it's extremely similar in concept to the disastrous D-Force for Super NES. Whatever else you might say about Vertical Force, you can at least take comfort in knowing that it handles this concept much more effectively than D-Force did. Rather than zooming the background in and out, Vertical Force instead zooms your ship. A combination of clever palette work, sprite scaling, and Virtual Boy parallax effects cause your vessel to shift between upper and lower levels with the press of a button. This happens much more quickly than in D-Force, and it lacks that game's disorienting zoom effect. You also need never worry about rising into unseen enemies on the foremost layer, because you always see bad guys, and they can switch between layers as well, using the same sort of scaling and palette shifting as the hero's ship. This turns Star Force's background-foreground element into something more meaningful than a mere gimmick. Here, it's integral to gameplay. Ducking and rising around the different pillars and beams of the enemy's fortress determines your path through the stage and shapes your combat tactics. Well, that's probably overselling it. Really, it just means that sometimes you can get snagged on the scenery and have to shift your position relative to the camera in order to get around the obstacle. But still, it's a neat idea. And that kind of sums up Vertical Force in a nutshell. A neat idea that doesn't quite live up to its potential. The game clocks in at a painfully brief 5 stages, and the first 3 of those are so numbingly easy, you could practically nap your way through them. Midway through stage 4, however, the intensity suddenly flies off the charts, and Vertical Force gets hard. Throughout everything leading up to stage 4, enemies rarely make use of dimension shifting, making it a tactic for the player to use almost exclusively to dodge fire and slip around barriers. In stage 4, however, enemies suddenly decide to go all in on layer switching. It's much harder to evade attacks when the attackers can suddenly zip up and smash into you from below. At the same time, enemies become a lot more aggressive with their projectiles as well in stage 4. Bullets, like everything else here, exist in layers, and you can evade projectiles easily by adjusting your altitude. But when you have far more enemies and bullets in both layers, and foes who follow you around no matter where you move, the game suddenly goes from toothless to cruel. It doesn't help that Of course, everything is rendered in monochrome. And even with artful palette tweaking and parallax effects, it's really hard to take in and process everything flying around on screen at once. The wildly inconsistent difficulty level and somewhat chaotic behavior of foes, I think, speaks to the development team's lack of experience with shooters. Or maybe it's just a side effect of the Virtual Boy's brief life. Vertical Force feels like a game that probably would have turned out pretty great with more time in the oven to refine its design and balance, but it's not like Virtual Boy afforded developers the opportunity to work out the kinks of their creations. It just wasn't around long enough. It's a shame because despite the lopsided balancing and eye-searingly busy visuals, Vertical Force is pretty decent. Besides making good on Star Soldier's layering mechanics, it also incorporates that franchise's streamlined power-up mechanics. Weapons appear as capsules, with each new pickup replacing your current weapon. There's a double blaster, a spread gun, a laser, and a shield, and each one can be upgraded if you collect a second capsule of the same type. Vertical Force also allows you to collect drone ships, similar to the options in Gradius, or mini-fighters in 1942. You can use the right D-pad to cycle between drone types, and each one has different properties. For example, some will change altitudes independently of the player in order to take out enemies. Each stage has a boss encounter at the end, naturally enough, and the midpoint of each level pits you against a recurring mini-boss, a suit of humanoid mech armor that learns new tricks each time you face off against it. It's a concept that appears in lots of other shooters, including various R-Types and Darius games, and it's every bit as good here as it is there. In conclusion, Vertical Force is a game of many contrasts. A mixed bag. Well, I could keep pouring on the cliches, but you get the idea. This builds on Hudson's legacy in a well-meaning way, but it doesn't quite turn out as well as you might like it to. Virtual Boy hosted a surprising number of great games, along with a handful of absolute stinkers, but Vertical Force falls into the merely mediocre category. Perhaps ironically, for a game about navigating the highest heights and the lowest depths, it ends up coming in somewhere in the middle. Virtual Boy Library gets its one and only media license tie-in, and it's a truly perfect match.